Welcome to our conversation on the Instagram clone project that you're working on. So this is Advanced React Week, or Intermediate React, we should call it. So it's your second week of React here at Lambda School, and you've been building an Instagram clone. Today we're going to kind of go over a little bit of the code that the architecture, how your app could have been laid out from day one yesterday. So just out of curiosity, I'm gonna take this poll real quick and ask how many of you basically have like a static rendered Instagram clone on the screen. So let's see, day one tasks completed. And then we'll just do a 1 through 5. So 1 is you don't even have a project built with Create React App yet. And 5 is you pushed beyond to the stretch problems yesterday. And a 3 would be you've completed most of the static stuff. It's just, a lot of the, styles and stuff probably aren't there. So a 3 is pretty much where I'm at. I took the challenge to get as much of this possibly done this morning as I could. So I spent about an hour playing around with this just so I could get a solution branch up there for those who aren't quite to a 3 or a 4 on today's project. So awesome. So it looks like some people have moved on to stretch and have already pushed into. So yeah, 5 would be comment functionality, which is what you're going to be working on more today. So there's a task in today's README that will kind of point you in that direction or challenge you to do that. So the idea is that we're going to have challenges kind of laid out for you each day. And the hope is that you can implement as many of those tasks as possible. So if you didn't get, all the tasks completed yesterday, you can start where you left off today, and you can reference the solution branch for yesterday as well. So it's like, oh, I didn't quite get that posts container thing going, or the comments aren't really being passed down properly as an array. So I'm going to look at the solution branch for day one, and I'm going to check out and see how Ryan did it, or how, what an approach is. And I'm not saying that my way is the 100% source of truth right way. It's just how I thought about approaching the problem. And that's plain and simple, just how engineering goes. A lot of times we get caught up in these things like best practices. I am an advocate for the idea that there are really good practices, and then there are some bad practices, and there's a lot of gray in between. I don't feel like there is such thing as a best practice for anything, because the moment we start putting definitives, and saying absolutely best practice is this, that's the moment that the JavaScript language changes, and then the best practices go out the window. So I think there's good practices, and I like to think that I try and follow good practices with a little bit of gray in between, and that's just, like I said, that's just kind of how engineers work. So, okay, so let's look at your day one assignment. So this is what I built. No judgments. I'm not super afraid of my code. But yeah, some of my icons aren't working in Code Sandbox. And yeah, there's some styling that I need to get through that I didn't have, enough time to sort of finish, but it sort of implements MVP up to a degree. It's not quite there. And I hate MVP. It sort of implements day one tasks for the most part. It's not quite there. There is definitely some work that needs to be done. It's pretty rough, but I'll continue to work on the day one and day two as we continue to go about. But yeah, there's a little comment bar here. We'll break this down and how this is all laid out. But yeah, kind of a fun little assignment. All the things that you got from those objects were, basically each piece of data you see here, this image thumbnail, the username, this image URL, all the comments and the user who made the comment. And yeah, it's kind of laid out that way. So nothing too fancy here, but It's a little bit more sophisticated data than what you've been used to thus far. So how many of you looked at that data and kind of gotten a deer in the headlights look? How many of you looked at the dummy data file and were like, what am I going to do with this? I have a nested array of comments. How many of you looked at it and were like, I got this, I can do it. You know, this isn't no thing. So yeah, sometimes we see data and we try and transcribe that data to the screen the best that we can. And that's really our job as front-end developers, is to take a design and then take data and put the two together, right? And hopefully you have a designer who knows how to be data-driven, how to work off of the data that you're going to be given from the back end. So our assumption here is that you just logged into Instagram and you saw this variety of posts, right, that are tied to your username. You got this object back from the Instagram API, and you're tasked to build out the user interface based on what the designer has going for you. So it's kind of a fun little project. But yeah, so let's dive into the code now that you've kind of seen my rough, almost embarrassing example. So in my app.js, this is all on Code Sandbox. So we are going to play around with some things here, so I might as well just go live. We'll do it live. And I'll let you guys follow along inside of Code Sandbox with me. So we're going to take a little tour of Ryan's implementation of the day one features. All right, so inside of app, we're holding on to our state inside of constructor. And that state is really just our dummy data. Okay, so we're exporting our dummy data and importing it here and then setting it up on the posts. Okay, so that's where all of the state for the majority of this application is going to live. And yeah, we're going to talk about sort of splitting that data off next, sort of how you could begin to think about the comment section idea. Because right now we're not isolated from our comments. So even though we got this all back from one data file, we're going to use our application to sort of stretch the bounds of what we can do by kind of splitting our data off from one another. Yeah, it's not from an API, I don't think. I think I would have to ask Ben. Believe it or not, Ben was the original curator of this project, and we have taken it and sort of run with it. So some of that data was put together by Sean and Ben originally. Okay. Old Ben Kenobi. Awesome. Yeah, Megan brings up a really good point. Because she was familiar with Instagram, she knew what the end product looked like and was able to sort of have a vision of what was supposed to sort of turn out. And that's hopefully going to be the case wherever you go and work, that you have an end idea in mind. Okay. All right, so post container. Post container is going to accept our posts that live on state. Okay, so let's go there. Let's take a look at post container here. Now, inside a post container, we are simply mapping over the posts and creating a new post for each item in that array. So this is where things start to get really handy in breaking them out into components. Thus far, you've been dealing with less, like I keep mentioning, less sophisticated data. Okay, so imagine if you had to build this whole thing out inside of this file. It's going to start to get a little bit unwieldy, right? And even still, there's ways that I could abstract this even further. But now inside of post header, I have all these divs and images and everything. So I'm separating things out based on their concern, based on what they're good at doing or what they are supposed to be doing. So this could be potentially its own component as well, since we're starting to get into some nested ideas. It's not much more than just a div and an image tag, so I don't think that there's a need for a post body, right? And then of course comment section would live inside of our post as well because it's sort of coupled with that data. Okay. Yeah, Yeah, so I'll hold Command on my Mac keyboard and hover over the component, and then it'll take me. If I click on it, it'll take me to that file. So it's pretty nifty. What's it called? VS Code does this really well. So, or if you're in VS Code, you can just Command P and type in the component, the file name, and you can just instantly hit enter, and it'll take you there as well. There's a lot of things you can do there. Okay, so virtually my post container, its only job is to map over our post data and generate a post for each object. Then our post component is going to also be a container component. It's going to hold our post header, our body, and then our comment section. Okay, so we're going to pass down the props that are necessary. So our post header, there's a lot of sophisticated styling going on there. So because I have that header, it's got an image tag, and then there's a username. So yeah, I mean, it's not super in depth, but we need to think about it in terms of what it needs. Okay. Now I'm pulling in some props that are necessary for this component to mount. So I'm going to ask you, what's something that I should do to refactor this component or to add on to this component to ensure that this data is what we expect it to be? What's something we can do in development that would allow us to, we could console log while we're developing, but what's a really cool tool that we learned about yesterday to check the data? Yeah, prop types. Remember, there is a questions answers thread. So I'm going to import prop types from, and I already have it installed, from prop types really quick and just refactor this component. So now, I'm still kind of in the implementation phase of the solution, so might as well just make sure that post header is doing what it's supposed to be doing. Thumbnail URL. And then username is going to be a string as well. Yep. Cool. Yeah, so really just kind of piggybacking on what some of our minimum requirements were, some of our tasks were, is to make sure our data that we're passing through components was exactly what it should be. And I could do the same thing to post as well, but I'll leave it at that, the prop types discussion from yesterday at that for sure. And we can just kind of move on. Okay, some of the more interesting things were probably where you're scratching your noodle, were revolving around icons. What did you all use for icons? Font Awesome? Cool. I have a problem where my Font Awesome isn't working in Code Sandbox, but I'm okay with that and you'll see the error that it's giving. I think I just need to research and figure out what it is. But if you notice, it's not allowing me to get those WAF files. Cool. There you go. That's perfect, David. And Joseph, if you just did images, that's totally fine. It's one thing if you're going to be working on a production app. So let's talk about this. This is a really good idea to talk about because, at Lambda School, we're trying to provide you with, advice and give you the ability to really not just learn how to code, but to continuously learn throughout your career. So we're teaching you that skill as well. And one of the things that you do on your day job is make architectural decisions sometimes. Sometimes when you're just rapidly prototyping something, going and taking a screenshot of an image and slicing it up a little bit and then styling it, that's great. That works out really well in prototype mode, right? But when you go to production, you need some icons and you want them to be SVGs. There's a dime a dozen library out there today that you can pay pro, or enterprise subscriptions for to get access to that company's icons. Most of the time at larger companies, you'll have a designer that provides those SVG files for you. So it doesn't matter to me what you use, which approach you took. I just care that you went out and researched it and you kind of figured out what you were going to do. This phrase gets thrown around often, and I don't know exactly how much I agree with the hyperbole of it all, but the phrase software engineering or developers is 20% code and 80% other stuff, communication, meetings, researching. I don't know if it's quite that drastic. I've written a lot of code at my day job, but I've also been in a lot of meetings. I would say it's more along the lines of 35 to 40% of code, actually writing code, and the rest, Googling, researching, making architectural decisions, implementing things like that. So try to use class name instead of class on your icon tags. I thought I did. If I didn't do that, then that was a huge blunder on my part. Let's see. Search bar. Yeah, I'm using class name. In fact, it would be less intuitive for me to type class on an image tag or on a HTML tag today. It's more intuitive for me to type out class name because of how much time I've spent in React. So cool. Yeah. So Kevin Brack posted, he basically pulled out the Sprite file from Instagram, which is amazing. I think that's a super intuitive move. And if you can learn how to use Sprite files, you will be building for performance. Now, performance is one thing, but development speed is another. Sprite files, they are really tricky to get in and out of, right? You have to take that full file and position it. I'd recommend taking that route if it's something that you want to learn, right? And then if you click the little heart, then you could just shift your Sprite file, transition it to a certain sprite, right? So Sprite files, we had a little discussion about that yesterday, I think, in one of the general threads. Somebody mentioned that that's how Instagram is doing their thing. And that makes total sense. Sprite file is an amazing tool that you can use. It's one single file, and all you do is position the background to select the image. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So CSS sprites would be a large file given to you like this, right? And then you just say, oh, if you want this this is a Vimeo and Dribble. So if you want those icons to be available or to be shown in a certain area, you basically sort of take this and move it around in the background. You use CSS to position it left, up, right. I went backwards there, but right, left, up, and down, right? You use CSS to position this file to show you the certain thing that you want. And it's a really fun trick that you can use to, make your life a little easier. So if you were to just Google Instagram Sprite CSS, you'd probably be able to pull out or pull their Sprite file from them, or Kevin could link it over to us again. So if you want to try and go that route, that would be a huge bonus ball. The main push for styling is going to be on Thursday for this app. So if you just got data to display and you're going to be laying it out and putting it together, making it look a little bit decent, that's fine up until Thursday. Then you're going to be learning. We're going to be teaching you some CSS and JavaScript tricks that you can learn, like a package called styled components. Okay. Yeah, Sam's right. The easiest way to import is through the index.html file. What I did is I npm installed, and then if you look at my index.js file, I just am pulling the font awesome minified version out of the CSS. So you can look at all this little solution. Okay. All right, let's shift gears and let's talk about the comment section, because this is where things are going to get a little bit tricky. Because eventually I'm going to have this input field that needs to accept some data, store that data on local memory somewhere, and then push that data into our comments array. Okay? let's look at our data and how it's been given to us, because that's a very good place to start when we talk about this type of thing. Today we're going to be getting into the component lifecycle, so we're going to show you some tricks of how to sort of use the component lifecycle to potentially store this data in a more permanent spot. We'll show you what I mean by that. Okay, so I have an array of objects here, and each object has a lot of information. Well, 5, 6 fields of information. And the reason I say a lot is because comments is now nested data. We have a document here that has a field of comments where there's an array of objects. And that array of objects is to be iterated over to display the comments page. So the way that I have this set up currently is that I have this little comments array right here, and I'm passing that down to the comment container inside of my post. So my comment section is going to take our comments and receive the comments on props. Okay, so this is where we're splitting off. This is where we're taking this array and sort of sending it to another component, another part of the React application tree. Even though it's a direct descendant of where that data came from, we're now sort of concerning ourselves, or we're thinking about this in terms of, now we're receiving these new props. So my goal here is to sort of decouple the comment section so that I can treat each comment section array separately, away from having to loop over the array and then find the comments and then push items into the array. I just want to allow this component to do its thing on its own, right? To sort of take on a life of its own with its own data. Now, what do I need to do to be able to do that? What would be, based on that kind of description, I'm going to be pulling off of the comments array and separating this component into its own source of truth, so to speak, right? I'm going to be separating it from the rest of the data and isolating that data. So what would I need this component? What do I need to do to refactor this component so that it can handle its own data? Yeah, I'm gonna turn it into a class. And this is just, once again, I'm not saying this is best practices. This is just what I would do if I was given this assignment. So I'm going to refactor this to take in a constructor, and it's going to receive some very specific props now. So we need to super those props. Let's take a look at that in just a second. And then we're going to say this.state and initialize our comments to props.comments. Now we can change this to reflect that it's its own component and select those comments. But we have a problem. I have declared a class, I have declared my constructor, but what's the R in CC&R? I need to call render. Render needs to be available to this component. And I am missing from. Oh. Woohoo! Thank you. What would I do without you? Okay, so now let's double check to make sure that our app is still rendering the way that we expect it to. But notice we've sort of diverged, right? We have split off. Let's see, console. Oh, those are just dirty. I just had a dirty console from earlier, so I'm preserving the logs. Okay, so now in our post container, we're receiving a new post for each item in our array. Each post passed down an array to comments. Okay, so that's going to be on props. And then we're just setting those comments on state. So now all we'd have to do to update this comment section is build out the functionality of our little comment form, right? So we would then take a little handler, add the item to state, and then push it into the array and call set state. It's pretty nifty. So that could be one approach that you take that allows you to use React for what it's good at, right? Concern yourself with the data that this component needs to be concerned with. And then we're going to do a little bit of control functionality inside of comment section. So who wants to describe to me why I included props in this constructor and in my super? Why would I need to do that? This is actually a pretty advanced question, but some people may know it. To pull in comments from parents, okay. Gain access to the parent's methods as well, so all the properties that live on the parent here. We're really getting access, of course, to the React component. But remember, comment section is a child of post. And post is delivering properties to our comment section. So yeah, the constructor, essentially what it's doing when we call super is super will go and actually invoke the parent's constructor. Okay, and basically give us sort of a cloned version of that constructor parent. So that way we have all of the methods and properties that we would need. So that you can do this, you can write this component without a constructor as well. Okay? I am saying that I prefer seeing you do it this way for now until you get in the habit of creating class components that extend the parent base component and then call our constructor. Because we have new, I forget the name of the syntax, but syntax to basically write out our methods in that new kind of syntactic way that allows us to get away from the binding, right? You could actually create a state object just inside of your component off of the constructor. And a lot of people are doing this today so that they don't have to write out constructor, and only if they don't need to extend the parent properties. Okay. So if you want to learn more about that, you can deeper dive into that paradigm, sort of learn the vernacular of that. I don't think it actually invokes post container as well, Mark, because I think what's happening, and this was just kind of made obvious to me earlier today when I was kind of going through an example, is that render will actually be the method that gets invoked. And because render gets invoked, notice our path. Render will get invoked here, right? So we return this new comment section, which will then call the render of comment section, right? So, which will then return this. And there's a couple other differences too, Arthur. Some people would argue that there's only a few instances where you need to extend all of the properties from component onto your class, right? Which is when you would want the constructor. So the other way is just setting state up statically on your component. Okay. In this way, we're going to be using constructor because of where it gets called in the React component lifecycle, which is the topic for today's discussion. Okay. Yep. Vim has a very good question. So I will talk about that right now. And then, yeah, so we're talking about basically peeling off our data, right? Sort of separating out the concerns. Vim asks, let's say we're working with the Star Wars API. We're receiving data via an API and populating state in the app component. Let's say we were peeling off that data in a lower level component. Would setting this peeled off data in the lower level state violate the idea of having one state or store for the source of truth? Yeah, it definitely violates it. Okay? But here's what's cool, is that after we violate that single source of truth, right, React provides this life cycle within it. And React is actually really, really good at using its own compartmentalized components to control their own state. Now, this is built into the React library. And a lot of people actually scoff at this idea, which is why a lot of people use something like Redux. Okay? Within a React application, just React, there is no such thing as a single source of truth for your data unless you're building something super trivial and you only have one state object that you care about for all of your components. Okay? As your application scales, you're going to need to filter that data off in different ways. Okay? So what I'm saying here is that is a pattern that a lot of people don't love. I, for one, actually find it really amusing that React is powerful enough to manage its own state object. Okay? When you want to follow the programming paradigm of single source of truth, which is what we're going to learn about in 2 weeks, you would reach for a library called Redux or MobX to take care of your store and your data. So store is synonymous with where your state could live. Okay? And basically add it outside of the component lifecycle. You basically add it to the top or the side of your application, however you want to look at it. But really, there's just an object that's your data, and then you have components that subscribe to that data. And that single source of truth paradigm in terms of data is very powerful. Okay? But I don't want you to confuse that with the single responsibility principle. Because single source of truth and single responsibility are two different things. Single source of truth is a principle that talks about managing your data storage in a universal global object. Okay? Single responsibility allows you to picture your components that do one thing really, really well. It's more action-based than it is presentation-based. Okay? And these are very complex topics, folks. So I don't expect you all to fully be able to muse along with me right now. But I just needed to make sure that Vim's question was answered before we dive into our topic for today, which is the component lifecycle in React. What does it mean that a component has a lifecycle? Okay. So hopefully that went over most of our heads, and there's a few of us who were able to tune into that. But yeah, let's now revert back to our topic for the day. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to demonstrate this really cool principle that the component lifecycle gives us. Because when we're thinking in React, we are thinking in terms of that single responsibility principle. Okay. So remember that a component can be a small piece of user interface that represents a small portion of our application. So each component, each class component in and of itself has a life cycle. And what is a life cycle? In biological terms, what does a life cycle mean? So let's get analogous here. What does a life cycle mean in biological terms? What does it mean for a living thing to have a life cycle? Birth to death, yeah? And then everything in between, right? So we have, it's funny, you guys typed the exact same thing. Are you sitting next to each other? Okay, so we follow this cycle. Okay, but there's more to it than that, right? What happens between birth and what happens between death? Yeah, there's a start and a finish, and I know we like to think of start and finish in a lot of instances. A life cycle is when a meme is created when the internet runs it into the ground. Man, that's true. There's a lot that happens in between there. What happens in between? Birth, life, and death. Okay. And then all of these things, like birth is a single kind of moment. Then we live, which is probably the most important part of our life cycle, right? And then we die. Okay, and that's biologically, that's a universal sort of truth to how how life works. And I'm sorry if that's news to any of you. And I just, I'm forcing on an existential crisis that we are born, we live, and then we die. There is definitely a lot more to your life than that. And components are not much different. Okay, components are born, right? They're mounted to the screen. We take this component and we construct a bunch of stuff out of that component. And that component actually gets rendered on our screen, okay? Or that data is saying, hey, this is what this component is going to look like, right? These are the methods that this component has available to it, okay? And then it's like, boom, render gets called and we have a birth, right? And that's kind of the initial phase in this idea, is that we set up our constructor, we build our DNA or our attributes, and then render gets called, and we actually come to life. Our component comes to life, so to speak. Okay, and that's all that's really happening in this component. There's really no way to kill off this component unless I, change or refresh the page or whatever. So we move into this idea that all of our components are much like us, and that they are given their DNA, and then they are rendered and born onto the page. But then there's a way to sort of conceptualize this. Now, what happens when this data changes? So when anything changes within this data, we grow. Our component mutates. Our component, goes through a change in its life cycle. Okay, and then what happens when this component actually gets dismounted or unmounted from the screen? And that would be sort of the death of the component. Okay, so all components, all class components in React have this life cycle built into them. Okay, and React actually provides with the component a few life cycle methods that will get called at certain places and times in the life cycle. So now, Dan Abramoff tweeted out, with the change to the new React API, he tweeted out this idea of the new lifecycle and how it pertains to React 16.3 and beyond. There are 3 phases that he talks about, okay? There's a mounting phase where constructor is called, this weird thing called get derived state from props is called, whatever, okay? Then we call render. And shortly thereafter, React actually is updating the DOM. Don't worry about refs. And then after that, we move on to our component did mount, okay, which is a lifecycle method. Okay, you can think of constructor and then anything that's in blue here as a lifecycle method in React. So you can tap into these and we can see how all of these will work. Okay. Now, get derived state from props is not a lifecycle method that I am going to teach you here at Lambda School. That's something that when you get into more sophisticated projects with Lambda Labs and things like that, that you will have time to research on your own and figure out when and where it should be used. I'm also not going to tap into should component update or get snapshot before updates, okay? But we'll talk about these green ones. We'll talk about constructor. We'll talk about render. And we'll talk about set state, et cetera, okay? But this is the life cycle of a React component. We have a mounting phase, a phase where components will be updating, and we can call certain functions in that phase as well. And notice that render is involved in both mounting and updating. And then simply put, we have an unmounting phase where one component lifecycle method will be invoked. Okay. So when a component is unmounted, we can't recall it and mount it again. It just depends on. So it's all dependent, and you're going to figure this out when we get to React Router next week. It's all dependent on what's being mounted, right? So if a component is in existence on the DOM, right, and then we navigate away from that page, and then we come back, it will be reborn and mounted and updated. You may have some new state to give that component or whatever, if there's like a login form, and then we can do stuff with that state. But what I'm getting at is this is virtually how things operate are in these three phases. Okay. Changes in state don't mutate the component. Changes in state will mutate the component as long as you handle those changes properly with something like set state. So if you have any mutations on your state, you need to make sure that you're actually invoking the set state method, because the set state method will force a re-render of components, or of the component, or multiple components, which we'll tap into. Okay? So yeah, I will challenge that, Robin, and I will say that set state will actually change the state, and then our component will re-render. Okay? So let's get an example of this. Let's figure out what this means, and let's talk about the sort of mounted phases. Now you're going to see things like component will mount, and get default state, and a bunch of other things that used to exist in the React API that are now being what's called deprecated or taken out of the React API. I would challenge you to look into, if you want, the actual React documentation to learn more about this. And then you can also refer to Training Kit as well, because there's a little section in there that we're going to kind of go over a little bit about today. Okay? All right, so let us dive into some code. I'm actually going to create a new sandbox. So sorry about the live session that's about to be terminated. I'll create a new one as soon as I have it ready. Okay, so I'm actually going to change this to a class component. I'm going to change that name. Okay. Whoops. Okay. Let me start a live session so you guys can follow along IRT. Okay, you should all still be able to click that link and join. That was really awesome. All right, so our little component lifecycle here is nothing more than an initial state and a render, right? So constructor will be the one of the first things that's called when we're using our components. So if I have, so I'm just going to console.log in here app constructor. So we can see it, constructor called. Cool. So we can see it in the console. Okay, so that's going to be one of the initial phases in our component lifecycle. If we refer back, I'm just going to bring this back over here. If we refer back to that image, we can see that, whoa, that got big fast, but this is good. We can see that mounting constructor will be the first thing that's called. Okay. So with our constructor, we're just going to be invoking our changes, and then we're going to be setting things on state. Okay. If I have something right here, let's subscribe to that state, and let's say my name is this dot state dot name. If I subscribe to that state, we're going to see that those are the changes, or those are what are going to get invoked. And I'm curious. So the state object here would be name. Okay, and I wonder if order of operations matters. Haha, okay, cool. So another caveat to not putting your state into the constructor is that whatever ends up in the constructor will override whatever was on your original state. Okay, so that was just kind of an amusing of my own. Let's try and get you a new URL if you can't join la session. Try that. Okay. All right, so let's look at what our next thing would be called. So like I said, we're going to ignore get derived state from props. It's actually a really more advanced topic when we get to asynchronous JavaScript and such. But then we're going to call render. So let's figure out what happens then. And I'm just going to actually take this, copy paste, and we're going to say app render called. Great, so just as expected, our render method was called. Okay? And here's where I'm going to introduce you to something new. Okay? Something that you may have seen from last week's sprint challenge, but you probably didn't work with. And that is this function called component did mount. Okay, and we're going to console log that same thing, but we're going to say did mount was called. And if I refresh the page, maybe I need to save it. Oh, you're not even going to see it happen. This is what's cool. So component did mount will be invoked after our render function is called. Okay? We're not doing anything to reinvoke did mount. Well, let's see. I feel like it should be. Oh, I have a typo. Component. Awesome. There we go. I was like, wait a minute. This should be invoked. I was trying to second guess myself. Okay, so notice the order of operations here. This life cycle in terms of mounting, so the component curation is going to invoke a constructor. Then it's going to call render. Then it's going to add all of its stuff to the DOM. Shortly after it adds everything to the DOM, component did mount will be invoked in case there's any asynchronous data that we need to handle. And it only will be called once. Okay, so component did mount only gets called once ever for each component that's in the life cycle. And then we have all of our data, right? So what we need to do inside of component did mount is, or what we need to use component did mount for is for retrieving some data that may take a little while to retrieve. Okay, so we use this thing called, which you're going to learn about next week, Ajax, which is a paradigm for how we use asynchronous JavaScript and XML. That's what the acronym stands for. But Ajax is going to be calling for data across HTTP networks. Okay, so using the hypertext transfer protocol, which is in, all of our browsers. So this is a very, very good place to fetch for data and then set your state accordingly. So let's say that I had a list of friends to our user here. And our first friend will be Bilbo Baggins. Next friend will be Gandalf. We've now got Frodo. And we'll say Gimli. Cool. So I didn't want to set that up there. I wanted this to be an empty array. Sorry about that. For this purpose. We're going to set that up down here. So our initial state is just an empty array. Then component did mount gets called after all of this stuff happens. Okay? But I'm going to wait like, I don't know, a couple of seconds. So I'm going to set timeout. And set timeout will invoke after the time you give it. So the time that I'm going to give it is 1.5 seconds. That's in milliseconds right there. But with inside of here, we can now call this .set state, which will allow us to do a shallow merge with this new array of friends into our state object. Come on. I meant to do this the whole time. There we go. Okay, so notice what just happened. We went through the lifecycle of the component, and after a second and a half, render was called again. Who remembers why render was called again? Yeah, we called set state. And then notice our friends show up a minute later or a second later. Okay, so the reason that render was invoked again was because set state was called. Okay, so let's kind of walk through what we've done here. Let's go through the process of talking about this, this component lifecycle of what we have on the screen. So we'll walk through the moment that we're starting to build some stuff, and then what happens when we render some stuff, and then what happens when set state is called. So constructor gets invoked. That's what's being demonstrated down here. Shortly after constructor gets invoked, we call render, which is going to paint eventually stuff to the DOM. And then our did mount function gets invoked, which is invoking the set timeout function that will be called 1.5 seconds later. And then we call set state, which then calls render again. So we have this ability to sort of tap into this pattern. Notice that in the updating phase, we have the access to set state, which we'll call render. And then we'll call, eventually, component did update. Okay? So another lifecycle method, component did update, by virtue, and I'm wondering if this will actually work, but by virtue of this diagram, should be invoked if there is a set state called. And it looks like it does. So as soon as we call set state, render gets reinvoked and did update gets reinvoked as well. So another nifty method that's available for us to tap into the React component lifecycle. Okay. All right, what we're going to do now is we're going to take a 5-minute break because we've been going at it for roughly under an hour. And when we get back, we're going to talk about why this is important. I've sort of shown you why it's important here, but I haven't done it enough justice. Like, why would this be important? And then we'll go through the unmounting phase of a React component lifecycle. Okay? So go ahead and let's do 6-minute timer. Please step away from the computer. You know who you are. And we will be back shortly. All right, we should all be ready to boogie. Okay, so let's take a look at component did update a little bit more so that we can kind of see an example of when would be a good use case for it. Let's say that because we are interfacing with this type of data, like this is too trivial of an example, but let's sort of theorize with it. By the way, can everyone hear me? Just making sure that I have a sanity check. You know how it goes sometimes with me. Okay, awesome. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at what the two arguments that can be supplied to component did update are. So one of the things that we can look at is the previous props. Okay, so the previous or what is it called? Previous state. Okay, and next state or something like that. Okay. All right, so check this out. And I guess it is previous props. So component did update can tap into sort of a moment in time when you had some changes that took place within your application. Okay, so we can pass the previous props that were given to this component, which in our case aren't anything, right? Because we're just simply extending the React component. We haven't passed any props to app. Okay. So we can take a look. What we can do is we can take a look at the previous props, and then after set state is called, component did update knows that there's going to be new state. So it's going to give us whatever was fed into our set state function, as well as what was already on our state object. Okay, so it's like whatever the next state is going to be. Oh, in this case, it's really just an empty array, right? Because yeah, set state is a little asynchronous. If I were to have a function that would change things again, let's just kind of see, just to exhaust the component did update example. So if I had a handler click state, I don't know what to call it. It's going to simply just call this.setState with a new item of foo. And in our current state, we're just going to say item is bar. And then we will be able to invoke this from clicking on our div. Terrible, but oh well. This dot handle click state. Okay. So now if I come and click on the div, you'll notice that render was called, and this should be previous props. Still, our props are the same because it's just empty object. Okay. Next state is given, and we have all of our friends from the previous, but then bar is still, item is still bar. It's not the new state. So the next time we call it, it'll be the next representation of the state. Okay. So it's kind of how that all works. When would this be? When is this actually useful? Well, let's say we want to look at any changed props and do something like scroll up the page based on new info. So imagine an app where you're staring at some content down at the bottom of the screen. You click on something, it's going to change and update the data, right? And then the changes that are going to take place are going to be at the top of the screen. As a user, you're going to want to be sort of navigated or scrolled up to that change or something like that. So any types of those transitions or animations and things like that are really good inside of component did update. And once again, All of these are found in the React documentation, and you can poke around in there. Okay. There you go. Yeah, so it would be empty on the first call because it's a representation, a snapshot of our original state on that call at that point. It's not going to be the new friend's state yet. Okay. They're just parameter names. You can name them whatever you want. Previous props, next state are useful to basically invoke. But yeah, they're just parameter names. So, but they will represent the previous props and then the subsequent next state that that you're going to be concerned with. I feel like it should be called current state, but whatever. I'm not the author of this library. Okay. So let's dig a little deeper now. This is all great. We have a pretty extensive app that's tapping into the life cycle of a component. But what happens if we have children components? Okay, so I'm going to make an app, and I'm going to call it child, and we're going to say name is going to be equal to this state name. And we're going to get rid of this, and child component is not built, so we need to go build it. Okay. Just going to give it some simple state. Okay, and then we're going to look at this component's lifecycle as well. Get rid of that for now. Okay. Just did a lot of stuff, so let's go ahead and save that. What just happened? Type is invalid. You guys are probably screaming at me, telling me that I did something. Did not export. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Logan, yes. About that, yeah, so I guess it's previous state. That would actually make more sense than next state. And so I got that wrong. It's actually previous state. I was looking at, there we go. That makes a lot more sense in my head. And probably did a lot more to help Vim as well. And then, yeah, snapshot will be a different thing. So, okay, 20 points to your Hogwarts house of choice. All right, so we got a lot of things going on here. So I'm actually going to stop calling. Well, no, I want to re-render. So let's look what happened. Let's look at our component lifecycle. Okay, a bunch of stuff happened before we even got to rendering our app. Well, I guess it'd be the second time. So that's why I want to get rid of this real quick. Let me just do this without a change. and then we can walk through this. By the way, this is like the 99% like the hardest thing that I have to teach. It's one of the easiest things to learn just from like seeing and then working with later. Not one of the easiest, but it's one of the lesser like evils. But teaching it is really difficult because it's like there's so many moving parts. But let's just focus here on this one little piece. So notice app constructor was called. Okay, so we construct out our app. And then app render was called. Okay, render is invoking a new component, child. So what happens at the next step in the phase is that the child's constructor needs to be called. And then it's going to go and do all of its things, child render, and then did mount, all before did mount gets called up here in our app. So just remember that did mount on your parent takes a back seat to the whole life cycle of any children applications. So it's kind of like if we were to look at it in terms of this, we have nested life cycles, right? It's very generational. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. So app is basically in charge of the child. So it allows it to do its thing before it will render, before it'll call its did mount. So that was just kind of important for us to look at right there. Is, well, how does all this fit together? What is all of this stuff doing? Because you're going to see it in documentation. Okay. But now that we've been musing on this for a minute, let's focus on component did mount, because I mentioned that calling for some data and setting that on state is what component did mount is best used for. Okay. Now, the thing to focus on here is the primary use case for component did mount is used for calling for some data, for example, from the Swappy API, and then setting that data on state when we have it. Okay. So what we need to do is go back to our previous example of our Instagram clone. And I want you all to make sure you fork my little copy of this assignment, go inside of app.js, okay, and make it so that dummy data will be set on state from component did mount instead of just rendering it right away on your posts on state. Okay, so click on fork in Code Sandbox. You should all be, oh, we got to go live still. Oh, we got an internal server error. Connected to live. Here we go. So make sure you fork it. And the steps are to use component did mount. Make sure I camel case this, to set dummy data on state, on our posts state. Okay, and then right after, I'll just let you guys do this for a couple of minutes. I'll let this timer count up to 4 minutes. No, not even that. We'll give you 2 minutes to do it. So when this gets to 2 minutes and 30 seconds, I'll answer Logan's question shortly after that. Joseph, you shouldn't need it to go live. You should just be able to click on the link and then click on the fork. And then it'll make it your own. So the link's right above, or right in the CS11 chat, the general chat. And Joseph, it looks like you're in here. So maybe I stop the session. Just make sure you fork it. Just click on the link above and then fork it. Try that one. Does that one work? Okay. Sorry about that. I'm still getting used to this live thing. It's pretty fun, but I'm still getting used to it. No, you want to keep the state in the constructor, Mark. You just will remove it so that it looks like this. Then all your posts are going to go away. Okay. I'll just give you another minute to work on it. All right, let us transition back. Sorry, I was replying to B-Derb, had a question. Okay, good stuff. All right, this is awesome. So I really, really loved Logan's comment because he's like, well, doesn't this give us a problem? What's going to happen to our data and our children, right? And if our children rely on that data to be mounted. So we'll get there, okay? Right now, you can see what's happening. Simply put, posts in this case, Logan. So let's make sure we pay attention to this part real quick. So posts in this case, just to answer that question. So Logan's question was, If you need to pass data to child components but don't fetch the data until the parent component mounts. I don't know how to formulate it into a question, but I see a conflict here. So the question that I would formulate is, what do we do with our posts, okay, in our post container where we have components that rely heavily on that information to be available to them, okay? So we're going to be passing this data down to post container to post, etc. Right now, you can see what's happening. The data that's being mapped over is being given an empty array. So because of that, React will just simply ignore it, right? If it's empty, it won't do anything with it. Okay, so let's take a look at how that works. If I grab component mount here, and I fetch for my dummy data, right? So it's like we're going to do a quick fetch real quick. You say this dot set state posts now equals dummy data. Boom. The information shows up. Does that make sense, Logan, as to why it's protected? Yeah. Logan responded, React ignores it because it was initialized in the state. We don't get an undefined error because it's in state. Yeah, I mean, an array is not an undefined value. So if I map over an array, just say array.map, it's just going to be, so item's not going to be anything, right? This is going to return us a new array. It's just empty array. So how does that play into React? What does React do with an empty array? If there's no items in it, if I were to say now, instead of rendering, okay, so right here, if I were to render an array of items, right? We can't see them because of the post. Let me just comment that out real quick. Oh, somebody asked about commenting out React code in JSX. Wrap it in curly braces, and then use /**/, and then wrap it in the 2 forward slashes. I have to do this. Come on. There we go. Okay, so this is what React is doing when you map over an, a bunch of items, right? React is taking those items and you're giving it an array, and then just by giving it an array right here, it's going to loop over each item and render that item, accordingly. Notice we have the unique key because this is an array of items, okay? So if I give this an empty array, what happens? And save, nothing. React simply will ignore it. So yeah, so Logan asked, so for fetching data versus like using Ajax, okay, we want to be sure to initialize the state first. Always, 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 always. I'll assume it's probably good practice in general to set all future state to null or empty values so that they won't render undefined and throw errors. And I would say that is a good practice, absolutely. Mark asked, so why is it that we can't define component did mount this dot state equals post dot dummy? Okay. It's because set state is the mechanism by which all updates are going to be programmatically assigned or delivered in the React lifecycle. So we'll never, ever, ever mutate the state directly. We'll always, always, always go through set state. That's sort of a barrier of protection that React built into the library. Mark asked, is set state the only way we can accomplish redefining what state is? Yes. Okay? Until you use something like Redux, which is a whole new ballgame. Okay, so in a React component lifecycle, set state is the premier way to update your lifecycle, to update your state. Awesome. These are great questions. Anyone else have any others? Anyone else feeling pretty confident about the component lifecycle as it pertains to this particular component? Okay, so Pauly, 1 out of 5. How confident are you at describing the life cycle of this component? Come on, Polybot. We'll wait for a minute on that. So I'm going to ask you, if you were to try and break this component down and tell me which pieces will be called and when, how confident are you that you could explain that? Okay, a 1 would be you don't know what's going on at all. A 5 would be you could explain it so that you could teach it to a 16-year-old. Did you already explain why it's preferable to set the initial state with component did mount rather than initializing the state with the data? It is only preferable if you're using asynchronous calls. So this is a derived example. Okay, I want you to get in this habit because next week you're going to start to use component did mount to use this thing called Axios to fetch for data, etc. Somebody asked, "Is this CRUD?" Kind of. It's not really CRUD. It's a part of CRUD, but it's not fully there. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, let's say this is a very eager 16-year-old. So this, just to recap, will be called first. Will be called second. Will be called third. This dot state gets called, will get called after set state. Awesome. So now you can access that and you can kind of figure out. So, make sure that you understand at least that, okay? For those 9 of us or so that are 1s and 2s, just make sure that you understand this. And then go and look at this beautiful little example of this image. Try and figure out when things would be called. Yeah, thank you, Tyson, for the clarity. Set state would be the U in the CRUD acronym, which is for update. So yeah, but yeah, we're calling set state and adding new data to our state object. Okay. So now the last thing that I want you to sort of think about in terms of data persistence, which is stuff that you're going to be working on a little bit later, but it will help you and you refresh your app and you make some changes and stuff, is this idea of local storage. So if you open up your Chrome console, you'll see that there's a bunch of tabs. Of course, you're kind of familiar with a couple of them. But the application tab will show you that there's a couple of buckets here, a couple of data storage objects, right? They look like tables. Right now, if I look, there are key value pairs on this little table here. So I can look and see what the information is stored in my browser, okay? JavaScript gives you the local storage API to actually add items, remove items, and persist items in that local storage, okay? Or session storage. We're going to concern ourselves with local storage for today. So in the part for your application, when you're trying to persist data or keep it around until, because somebody's going to make comments, you're going to want those comments to be stored somewhere, which is going to get a little tricky for you, but I don't think it's more than a stretch. I think it's a little bit beyond that. But it's important that I show you how to use local storage, okay? So there are three major functions that local storage uses: a getter, a setter, and then a destroyer, like delete. So what we do is we give set item a key value pair, okay? So the key will be a string name. The item itself will be the data that you want stored in local memory. Ryan. So if I call window.localStorage and I call set item, it's going to go and it's going to add some memory to my local storage. Notice that key value pair Ryan and name exists. Let's go back to the console. If I want to retrieve that information, all I have to do is call the getter. And it gives me back whatever the value is. Okay, so sorry, we've shifted gears a little bit, Vim. I can answer your question in like 5 minutes because this little demo of local storage is actually pretty trivial. And then if I want to destroy that item, you'll notice that it's going to go and dump it out of the local storage bucket. Okay, so you can think of this as a place to basically keep memory that you may want around for longer term. Okay? So what happens now if I actually set something that's more sophisticated than a simple string? Super sophisticated. Eventually, you could translate this into an array of objects as well. Well, let's say that I'm going to store my strings on local memory. Local storage, set item, array of strings, and okay, let's take a look at our application. Ooh, array of strings. Notice there is no array around these strings. So we sent an array of items, but these are just strings. So what happens now if I actually, man, that's kind of a bummer because I wanted it to be an array, right? So now let's see, we have an array of strings that are stored in memory. Let's see what happens when we local storage get item array of, why do I keep doing that? What was it called? Array of strings. Okay. Got to be quotes. What the heck? I sent an array. Why is it stringified? Why is it just a bunch of strings? Well, this is a major gotcha when it comes to using this. So if you're going to be using local storage to set an array of items, you've got to sanitize that before it goes into local storage. Let's see what I mean by that. Let's remove this item and look at our application. It's gone. Back to console. So when I say we need to set our item sanitized, strings are the only type of data that can be stored in local memory. So if I want to turn an array into a string version of an array, what's the JavaScript method that I have to my disposal? Does anyone know? Yeah, we're going to stringify that. Okay? How many of you have seen Stringify before? A couple of us probably. Yeah. So now let's see what the shape of our array looks like. Oh, okay. Now we have a string version of this array, a stringified array. And it's fun because we can see a little visual representation of it down here as well. Now, what happens if I were just to retrieve this item? Uh-oh. Stringified. Okay. So that's a problem. How do I change that? Haha, Kevin, you're on it. So let's get the item, but first, let's json.parse it. Then we have our array back. Okay? So let me take this example. I'm going to just kind of copy and paste it over in Slack so you guys can play around with this at your disposal. It's going to be really helpful when you get to this item or this moment. Okay. So my goal or my request is that you play around with local storage for just a little bit between, starting your day in the afternoon, starting your project in the afternoon and lunch. Or if you want to go play around with it now, that's fine. So now I'm going to shift gears. Well, really that's all you need to know about the JSON or the local storage. How you would be able to use this inside of a React application, you could simply component did mount and call window.localStorage if you want and set some item. And we'll call it mounted. We'll send a true. We'll see if it'll allow it to do that. And let's go and look at our local storage and see within code what just happened. I wonder if there's a blocker on this, or if I just need to refresh the page. It was there? Maybe it's this one. There it is. Haha. Cool. It was just on, it's not on the codesandbox.io. It's on the codesandbox.io with my URL mounted to it. Yay, so we can retrieve it. So if I wanted to set all of my data from my posts, okay, so let's take a look. If I want to set comments, for example, we're going to json.stringify. This would be a terrible place to do this, but no, it's fine. Dummy data dot comments. No, we're just going to put all the dummy data because we're not looping over it. Okay. There we go. That's all of our data right there in local storage. Cool. Okay. All right, let's shift gears and let's move on to a Q&A for the rest of the morning. So if you want to get a head start on this afternoon's assignments, you can boogie out of here, or if you want to stick around for a little Q&A between now and lunch, we'll keep it there because local storage is now ready for you to rock. So nice. How can we save the CSS styling of an element in local storage? So when I refresh the page, the styling doesn't reset. In the real world, you'd want to use something like a service worker for something like that, which is a little bit more complicated. When you get into CSS and JavaScript on Thursday morning, we will most definitely muse on that. Okay, talking about some of the benefits. So yeah, some of your styling, it shouldn't reset. There should be a cache that's doing the styling automatically of some sort, but sometimes when we refresh our page, it takes a minute. But yeah, if you're getting some flickering, it might be, yeah, I couldn't tell you what the problem is there. Okay. Let's see, Vim did have a good question about child state is set, okay? So if a child state is set and the child is re-rendered, will the parent be re-rendered as well? The idea is that your children depend on what? So your children depend on props, right? So if the parent's state is re-rendered, then all of the props of the children will have to be passed back down to those children, right? So then the render methods and the life cycles will all get re-invoked for all the children components that are subscribed to that props. Hopefully that answers your question, Vim. Vim then asks, what are some popular use cases for local storage? Setting some information about the user that's interacting with your application. For you, playing around with these toy problems because you don't have a database set up, so you can set your memory there. Logan asked, if we're going to use something like local storage, how would we use that setting our state? Since we already set state with component did mounts. Good question. Well, notice that we just set our JSON stringified dummy data inside of here. So what can I do? If window.localstorage.getItem comments is defined, then this dot set state with that data. Yeah? So we set state with the dummy data. Or sorry, we would set state with the JSON parsed. So it's going to call one or the other, right? Else, yeah. So kind of gave away a little bit there, but use it. Yeah, it's keeping the data around longer than just on state. I knew what I was asking. Nice, Logan. You got me. Any other questions? You have me for 9 more minutes before we all go to lunch. Day 2 repo. It's the same repo. Same exact repo, different README. Okay? It's called the Day 2 README. It should be in your project already, all ready to go. Okay? Look at the tasks for Day 2. Use lifecycle methods. In app.js, use component did mount to set your data to that component state. Use a state object to pass your post container. Add comments. So this is going to be a big one. Create a function in app.js called add new comment that takes an event and an index number. Okay, so a little bit of a contrived implementation there. If you want to go that route with the form, you can. If you want to do it on an on-click handler and not worry about the on-submit event, whatever. It's completely up to you, but yeah, this is a path to the implementation. Pass the add new comment function down to the component tree where you have your add comment. So remember, we kind of refactored our comments so that we could make this a little bit easier. To add a comment, input should be wrapped in a form. Update your state with the new comment. So that's really, it's gonna put you through that. The next thing is liking a post, okay? This will be set up a lot like add comment input. Pass a function down to where your heart icon is and use an on-click event handler to increment that post likes. Now, you should potentially force a user to only allow them to like once, but you can figure that out. If you want to, they could click like a million times and whatever, but a bonus ball would be, try and make it so that a user only does it once. Search functionality. Set up the search bar, just like comment input and the like button, and your function filter out any post whose username does not match the search term passed. Okay, so there's 3 major portions of functionality to work on today, and then using the component lifecycle methods. And then persist your data using local, he meant to say local storage here. If done correctly, you'll be able to refresh your page and see your new comments. Add the ability to delete a comment from your data. Ooh, that's a big deal. If your data is in local storage is what they meant. So, okay, but yeah, here's the idea. Functionality. If you don't have the form yet, if you don't have it filled out like this, go ahead and lean on my code in Code Sandbox and see if you can get there and then start working on the functionality. And don't worry if you're not quite there today. What is the difference between an asynchronous call versus a synchronous call? Difference between synchronous and asynchronous is that one happens synchronously and the other one happens asynchronously. The only reason I'm kind of giving you a cheesy answer is because we're going to be getting into that all of next week. So really, synchronous JavaScript is just read top to bottom, left to right. Asynchronous JavaScript is JavaScript that can batch calls and they can be called in a different place and time, and your program can still work. And we'll go over that for sure. What are the majority of lifecycle methods we should be concerned with? Surely not all these can be used all the time. Absolutely, Logan. Render, constructor, and set state are the 3 that you will work with the most common. The next most common will be component did mount. Okay. I was asked if my posts have a shadow or an offset style. I will let you dig into my code and inspect it and figure that out. In one of these CSS properties, there is some shadowing. But I'm not going to show you right here. I'm going to let you do some digging into some old guys. I'm not that old, but some guy's previous code. That's really important thing. So yeah, jump right in, Jameson, and kind of figure out which box shadow I'm using, how I'm using it. And then if you want to implement it on your own, I simply just Googled subtle box shadow. And I just picked the top one and I just changed it a little bit. So when do you need to pass props to a parent constructor in app? Awesome. The only time you would need to pass props is if this was a child component. So for example, we're using post container that is receiving props on its component like this, okay, on its attributes. So because of that, post container being a class component, well, posts being a class component, where was it? Comment section, derp. Because comment section being a, where is it? Right here, class, we need to extend those props. Cool? Other questions? All right, I really hope this little demonstration of the lifecycle method cleared a few things up for you. I know that it's the crash course, right? There's so much more to it than this. We didn't even cover unmounting, right? So you'll have to sort of, but now you know exactly how you could kind of figure out how to tap into it, right? So, please continue to push yourself into the documentation, into training kit, and reach out if you need anything from us. We're always here. I was told yesterday that We had some good signs that not a lot of students were reaching out to the project managers. It's pretty quiet in terms of assistance and things. And I'm going to take that in terms of you guys are just putting your heads down and getting to work. And if you need anything, if I'm receiving DMs, I know that, there's stuff that I need to make sure that I'm more clear about, or you need to, be more clear on before moving forward. But please, please, please understand that banging your head against the wall and being stuck and feeling like you're overwhelmed and outside of your comfort zone too far, that you're shutting down, come back into the comfort zone and ask me, ask PM. Let us be there for you. That's the name of the game. Okay, so we are here to ensure your learning. If you are not learning, we need to fix that. So I'm going to ask at the end of this, I'm going to ask a little poll. I'm going to just have you mention how confident you're feeling in approaching today's afternoon assignment. Awesome. Logan, that's an amazing piece of advice. Okay, so stay tuned to for that poll, and then go to lunch and have a great rest of your afternoon. We'll talk to you soon.